start recording. So what I will do also is upload the video of today's session to the Mentorship Network website. So if you want to access it after or review some of the details, you're welcome to do that. Jill will be speaking to the topic of writing a well-argued paper. And I see a few people just coming in to the room as well. So welcome to Jill, and thank you for joining us today. I know you're also facilitating a writing retreat this week. So lots of people getting work done during reading week. So thank you and welcome.
At the risk of making a really lame joke, maybe it should be called Writing Week. Who knows? Okay, that was really lame. So I have a slide deck that I'm going to share with you, and I would encourage you to engage with the questions that I pose. And you could either contribute in the chat or you can unmute yourself, really depending on your level of comfort. And we'll really just get into some of the expectations when it comes to argument in an academic paper and some of the common challenges and how to work through some of those issues. So I'm definitely interested in hearing from you. So let's share. Get all this ready to go. I'll turn off my video just because it'll be one less thing for me to monitor during the session. So I'd like to actually start by first getting a quick survey in terms of what you actually want to take from today's session. Because if there is something that we don't address, then that is something where I'm more than happy to meet with folks individually, or it's something that if we have a bit of time, maybe I could speak to more explicitly. So what are some of the things that you're really hoping to learn about argument today, or what do you want to learn from today's session? So let's take maybe 2 or 3 minutes, and you can either contribute in the chat or you are more than welcome to unmute yourself and contribute that way. So we have lots of really great comments popping up, and I'd like to address them in terms of identifying whether or not that is a focus of today's session, and if it isn't, where some of the information might be available elsewhere. So questions around creating solid or strong arguments. And I think we can interpret that in lots of different ways, because it could be about how to sustain an argument, how to support it with sufficient evidence and logic, for instance. And that's certainly a key focus today. Making transitions between paragraphs is less of a focus today. But I can certainly provide some resources around transitions and developing paragraphs. So I can do that during one of our little pauses in the presentation. Some of the pitfalls or challenges when developing arguments, we touch on that a little bit. And yes, we definitely look at counter arguments. We don't talk explicitly about trying to find that sweet spot with the argument, determining if it's too narrow or too broad. And I think that's simply because so much of that is dependent on context and the quality of evidence that you have at hand. But I think it relates in large part to the notion of claims and subclaims, the sort of relationship between those two elements. Because if you have a broader claim, then the way in which you start to support that broader claim is to have subclaims, which look at it from a more focused perspective that help to make a stronger case. A broad sort of a framework or checklist for presenting ideas clearly and succinctly. I don't have an explicit checklist, but certainly we'll look at some structures that might be really helpful, as well as some sentence frames that might be of use. I don't talk about managing literature or resources, but that's where something like a citation management software might be of value. So something like Zotero or Mendeley, that might be of use to you. A couple of questions about synthesis. That's a little bit outside of our focus today, but I can certainly provide some links to some other resources that might help you out there. And then that balance, how do you maintain your own voice, your Indigenous voice, when you're really immersed in a different cultural context, this Western context? And that's a really good question. It's not something that I look at in today's session, but I think it speaks a lot to how we consider argument in different cultural contexts. And admittedly, I'm looking at it from a very Western perspective. And I'm also going to critique elements of that expectation, because in some ways, the structure of argument in a Western context is kind of strange, or at least in an English Western context is kind of strange. And I acknowledge that. And I think it's because of this distinction that we make in terms of how we, or this sort of strange expectation that we might have about what a reader needs or what a reader wants. And so feel free to interrogate that at your leisure. But certainly in terms of that balance, it also speaks to trying to source a wider range of evidence and evidence from different cultural perspectives. And if you're having difficulty finding evidence that is complementary to what you're doing, that's when I would really consider connecting with your librarians to help you source information that might provide a stronger counterpoint to these Western perspectives. So I definitely recommend getting in touch with your librarian. And then lastly, presenting ideas clearly and precisely with that strong argument. All right, so I'm obviously not going to be able to address everything here today, but I am happy to try and surface some additional resources as much as possible. And again, you're more than welcome to connect with me afterwards if you want to have a chat about something that you think I might be able to provide some support with. All right, so our our agenda today is we're going to look at sort of common arguments in academia, because I find that sometimes when it comes to understanding what an argument can be, that's often one of the bigger leaps that we have to make in order to recognize that so many things are arguments, but they might be presented in a slightly more subtle way. We're going to consider academic argument in relation to culture slightly in terms of that broad structure. Some of the characteristics of balanced academic arguments, and this is where we really hone in on the role of counterarguments and strengths of claim, and then some common challenges. All right, so we're going to look at two short pieces of text. And as we read through each one, I would encourage you to identify what would you say is the argument that's actually being expressed in the excerpt. So this is our first excerpt. This is from the American Journal of Preventive Medicine, and it reads as follows. A broader notion of health that expands beyond the clinic is establishing itself not only in medicine, but in society at large. This expanded definition parallels recent interest in the social and environmental determinants of health and in linking health care with public health. In the US, NIH's National Center for Complementary and Alternative Medicine recently changed its name to the National Center for Complementary and Integrative Health. Thus, although the term integrative medicine has a well-established definition, the term integrative health does not. The growing popularity of the term makes it critical to adopt a common definition that can better facilitate discourse and be used to design relevant research, create metrics, and effectively advance the field. I apologize for stumbling a bit. I think there's a typo there that needs to be addressed. But what would you identify ultimately as the argument of this piece of writing? What are the authors trying to convince you of in their text, or the text that you're going to be reading? What would you identify as the argument here? Yeah, so just further to the comments that are popping up, we're looking at, okay, this is ultimately an argument about definition. And so the stakes might not actually seem that critical to someone who's outside of the field, but based on how this information is being presented as readers, we're able to start picking up the fact that, oh, okay, this is the argument. We're making a claim about definition, and this is coming out through some of those key words, makes it critical to adopt. Okay, in an academic context, that is quite an explicit way to start signaling argumentation. When you're making a stance like that, your readers paying a bit more attention, knowing that you're going to have to support this claim as the text develops. So let's look at another piece of text. Again, my question to you, where is the argument? So it reads as follows. Ecological niche modeling has proven useful to forecast the distribution of a vast number of organisms and is increasingly employed to predict parasite distributions locally and globally. Despite great strides made in the implementation of ecological niche modeling to forecast complex biological phenomena such as disease systems, traditional frameworks may render biologically unrealistic predictions and thus must be revised, as we show in this review. We provide an overview of the current state of disease and propose a framework based on the biological properties of both parasites and hosts to produce reliable outputs resembling disease systems distributions. Okay, so where's the argument? Why should we pay attention to this text as it continues to develop? What are the authors striving to do? Exactly. That must be revised. Again, sort of that equivalent of shouting in an academic context. And that's what's signaling to readers, oh, okay, this is the claim. Because someone else could come along and say, well, actually, those traditional frameworks work perfectly well. We don't need to change them. And so when there is a potential for disagreement, that's when we have to, that's where we sort of recognize where an argument is developing. So we have, must be revised. And then they also provide or propose this framework. And so they're claiming that a problem exists, and then they're inserting a solution in response to it. And this is a very classic way of signaling argument where we identify, oh, here's a problem, this is why it's a problem, and guess what? Here is a potential solution or possible solutions. And so this makes it very clear to readers that now we're relying on the writers to support their argument and convince us of it as the text develops. So when we're considering some of those common arguments in academia, they tend to cluster around the following 5 categories. We have claims of fact or definitions, and that we saw an example with our first piece of text. And then we have claims about the value of something, and value can be defined in so many different ways. We might be making claims about intellectual value, social value, cultural value, economic value, technological value, ecological value. The list sort of goes on and on and on. But basically, what we do is we assert that something is important, something is notable, and we're explaining why that's the case. We might make claims of judgment or evaluation, where we're identifying something as either good or bad, strong or weak, realistic or unrealistic. Now, in an academic context, it's usually going to be a little bit more nuanced than that, not quite as black and white, but certainly if we're criticizing someone else's work, we're making judgments, we're making evaluations of what they have done. And then claims regarding the need for something. And this is what we saw in that second example, where we're identifying a problem or problems and proposing a solution. And it tends to be quite action oriented. So we want people to do something differently as a result of our argument. From a cultural perspective, in a Western English speaking environment, this is the general style and organization of argument. And it has its flaws because it's really making an assumption that argument progresses in a very linear fashion when you're presenting it in writing. And that's not necessarily how argument tends to develop as we are writing. And this is where sometimes you might find it somewhat challenging in order to ensure that our text sort of fits within this standard. And this is not the case in all Western cultures either. In different language groups, you might have a different structure where the argument isn't explicitly stated early in the text, and instead it sort of gradually emerges as you progress. But this is the structure that has long existed within an English language speaking context. So there is an expectation that the argument is explicitly stated very early in the text, so that readers have a very clear sense of what the sort of context for debate is. And then there is reference to the evidence, whether this takes the form of presentation of results or other forms of evidence, then the introduction of counter arguments and interrogation of those counter arguments, and then sort of wrap up in the conclusion with some implications being discussed. So this is quite a rigid format, but there can be a little bit of flexibility. So it might be that counter arguments are actually introduced or integrated with reference to evidence in order to create a more nuanced picture of the topic under debate. But as a general structure, that's sort of what we fall into in a lot of academic contexts. So from a writer's standpoint, this can become quite frustrating because often as we're writing, we develop the argument in a way that's much more articulate, much more nuanced, much more complex than we might have originally anticipated. And so often, the really wonderful articulation of our argument is sort of naturally positioned in that concluding section. And so what happens is during the revision process, we might find ourselves in a situation where we decide, actually, I'm going to take this piece and I'm going to move it to the beginning of my text so that my reader has that really good understanding of the argument from the very start. And so that's just a fairly common experience for lots of writers. I know it certainly is for me, that often things just sort of coalesce in a more articulate way the further along you go through a text. So again, this is reflecting certain cultural assumptions where there's almost an assumption that readers have to we almost treat them as if we can't trust them. It's almost like we were sometimes in a bit of a defensive position. So we want them to know from the very start what the argument is, what the limitations of that argument is, or how that argument is being bounded, and then remind them of that as we go through all of the evidence and go through all the counter argument. So a lot of our strength of claim will be reflected in our language use. So let's take a look at two samples of text, and we're going to see them in direct contrast to each other. And my question to you is, from your perspective, which sample is making a stronger claim? Who seems more confident in what they are claiming? So sample one reads as follows. Jurisdictional chaos among government agencies caused by the delays both in communicating the leak of the Echo Valley pipeline and in remediating the oil spill. If government agencies at the federal and provincial level had clear oil leaks and spills, and their cleanup would be more efficient. Sample two. Evidence suggests that jurisdictional chaos among government agencies contributed to the delays, both in communicating the leak of the Echo Valley pipeline and in remediating the oil spill. If government agencies at the federal and provincial level had clearer roles, oil leaks and spills and their cleanup would likely be more efficient. So which sample seems more confident or stronger in their claim, sample one or sample two? And what might account for that difference in strength? So it's the based on the comments in the chat, I might have mispresented this task. But yes, we do have reference to evidence in that second sample, and so that's going to change our impression, perhaps, of the text. But I guess the question I was asking is who seems to be making, who seems to be more confident in their claim. But really, the intention of this exercise is to really interrogate the subtleties of language and see how that can add nuance to our claims. So let's take a closer look at some of those language pieces here. And the information is very, very similar when we look at both of these samples. The main difference is some of the word choice. In sample one, we have phrases like, or words like caused and would be more efficient. And in sample two, we have words like suggests and contributed and would likely. And what this does is it can modify how we interact with the claim that's being made. And in an academic context, often what we're going to see more examples of will be that second sample. We're going to see more text that creates nuance through hedging, because in academia, we're trained basically to really question anyone's claims. And if someone makes too strong of a claim, then they make themselves vulnerable to criticism. So in that first sample, you have someone making, arguably, very strong claims of cause and effect, as well as strong conditional claims. And because of the strength of those claims, it can be more difficult to then support the argument, because again, you have, there's more of a burden to prove all of the points or the claims that you're making. In contrast, with sample two, the claims are slightly more cautious. And again, this is much more representative of argumentation in an academic context, because it references the fact that things are complex and that there might be lots of different variables at play, and that the world has a lot more nuance and gray areas than not. And so recognizing how language can sort of protect us or modify our arguments and our claims is quite a good skill to have, because it can communicate something quite significant to our readers about the level of certainty that we have. So you can mix and match, obviously, depending on what the claim is. If you have very, very, very convincing evidence, you want to convey that more strongly in your language. But if the evidence is a little bit more inconclusive, or there might be some other variables at play, then making use of cautious language is going to be the way to go. And so what this is often referred to is hedging. And in hedging, we just, again, convey some of that caution, some of that nuance, in order to demonstrate to our readers that we know we might not necessarily know everything about the situation, but based on the available evidence, these are some of the claims that we could make. These are some of the conclusions that we could arrive at. And so it's really about creating some limits or around what we're saying. And so it's about making our claims proportionate to the evidence. So if you want to weaken or soften the strength of claim, you have lots of different options available to you. And again, you see these very frequently in academic contexts. It's in some ways, an academic context is almost the opposite of a political context, where some of the messaging tends to be simplified. In an academic context, we're always sort of complicating the issue. We're adding more and more layers as opposed to stripping those layers away. And so to soften or weaken that strength of claim, we can make use of verbs, modal verbs, adjectives, adverbs, nouns, and just general expressions. So for example, appear, contribute, tend, seem, suggest, indicate, estimate, might, may, could, would. If we think back to some of our very first examples that we were looking at today, I believe may and might and I think maybe suggest came up. I'd have to double check. But again, we see that they're just part of that academic context. Adjectives, few, little, probable, possible, relative, slight. Adverbs, likely, probably, largely, relatively, arguably, typically, possibly. Nouns, tendency, likelihood, contribution, indication, probability, possibility. And lastly, those expressions, to some extent, on balance, in some, many respects, in principle, up to a point, etc., etc. And so again, we can just layer those in when we know that the situation is very complex and we can reach certain conclusions based on the available evidence, but maybe there's evidence out there that we don't have access to. So if we were to look at the following examples here, if we were to slot in these words or phrases into the above sentence, what would you identify in terms of the strength of the claim? Would you say it's a strong claim? Is it a weak claim? Or is it a neutral claim? So many studies have concluded that excessive credit growth blank the 2008 global financial crisis. So what would you say? For caused, may have contributed to, was probably a major cause of, was one of the causes of, might have been a factor in, and contributed to. So let's take a minute or two and contribute in the chat. Yep, so that was probably a major cause of, it's definitely hedging. It's really softening the strength of the claim, for sure. I just want to be mindful of time because I don't want to have to rush too much. So let's take a look at how we could break these down. And again, an exercise like this I think is always useful because it sort of reminds us of how subtle language can be and how we can manipulate language in order to really position ourselves as deliberate and thoughtful scholars and writers. So caused, I think number one is it's a very strong claim. And often we are sort of instructed away from using this unless you have very firm evidence. I think this is one of the, excuse me, I think this is almost one of the main takeaways from almost any research methods course. Sorry, I'm not sure why I'm losing my voice. But when we're adding complexity, when we're adding layers, we want to modify and slightly soften the strength of those claims. And so actually most of the ones that are presented here are fairly weak. And it's not that it's not an important argument to make. It's just that we recognize, I have to be a bit careful in how I'm presenting this because other people might say, oh, well, you don't have evidence for this or you don't have evidence for this. So it's a way to be a little bit protective, but it's not to say that we shouldn't make these softer claims. We just recognize that there's complexity there, and we modify our language accordingly. Was one of the causes of that's it sort of hovers between a neutral and strong because one of the causes sort of recognizes that there might be multiple factors or multiple variables, which helps bring it more into a little bit of a neutral realm. But still, when we're identifying this notion of a cause in that way, it can also bridge into to strong. Whereas you could soften it if you were to say may have been a cause of, which is sort of similar to what we see in 3. And then contributed to, quite neutral. I think this is why that notion of contributed to or that phrasing tends to be so popular in an academic context. All right, so let's continue. But yay, it's sort of like the fun of language, I think. So let's break down argument. Now, I'm not sure about you, but if you went through middle school and high school, depending on the teachers that you had, you might have had to do debates in class. Just feel free to share if you ever had to do debates in those environments, and feel free to share whether or not you enjoyed that experience, because I think some people really enjoy it, other people do not. I was not really a fan of them myself, I will admit. However, if you've gone through that experience, some of that element of debate actually is very useful in terms of understanding how we put together argument on paper, because we are, again, always trying to anticipate what someone could argue based on what we've said or based on the topic that we're dealing with. So when we're talking about academic argument, it's really, we're making a claim about something debatable. If something is accepted across the board, we can't really debate it, so there wouldn't be a point. And so we have to identify that something is debatable and that it's worth debating about. And we engage with those counter arguments in order to strengthen our claim. And we are engaging with subclaims in order to support the larger argument that we're making. And often that's going to be expressed in the topic sentences of our paragraphs, and then they are supported with evidence. So we're going to look at some key terms. The first is the claim, which is a debatable assertion that something is true. So for instance, adults generally prefer to avoid losses when making decisions. So we could debate that ad nauseum. A fact, a statement that is true by virtue of its correspondence to widely accepted evidence. For example, Paris is the capital of France. Data, information about units of analysis, often presented in tables, graphs, and charts. And evidence, facts, and data used to support a claim. So here we might be pulling from this article from an economics journal. Oh, okay. When it comes to sustaining the bigger claim, we have that larger uniting argument, and then we have the subclaim, the evidence, the bridge that's going to sort of link back to the main claim, the counterclaim, the rebuttal, and the concession. So the claim, that's again what is being debated. The subclaim is sort of this, as it suggests, a smaller component of the main claim that is a natural extension of the larger claim. The evidence, that could be facts or data or logic. The bridge, that it's usually going to help link back. The counterclaim, this is where we're trying to anticipate things that other people might say, and a reason to reject the counterclaim, and then a concession. So sometimes we might acknowledge that actually this is something worth acknowledging, even though it might be somewhat irrelevant to the topic at hand. Another way to conceptualize claim is as follows. So we have, again, that larger debate. We have our introduction, and then we have those subclaims, and you could have lots of those, and you could have counterclaims, and you could have several of those in a conclusion. So much of it will depend on the context in terms of the number of subclaims and the number of counterclaims. Here is an example. If we were to state that hybrid cars are an effective way to fight pollution, you'd sort of introduce the concept, and you would identify, well, when you think of conventional gas-powered cars, they're a main contributor to air pollution. And these conventional cars account for a huge amount of pollution across a person's or across the car's lifespan. And hybrid cars have less pollution. And the counter argument might be, why are we talking about personal vehicles? We should be investing in mass transit. And so that would be a counterclaim that you'd have to, or counter argument rather, that you'd have to engage with in order to recognize whether or not you're fighting the wrong fight or that you're arguing the wrong point. So we have about 10 minutes left. We're not going to have quite enough time to go through everything as planned. But what I want to do is quickly go through the key elements of organizing an argument, as well as identify some of the common challenges. So for our first subclaim, when it comes to the role of the hybrid car, we would make that claim that, well, driving a car is typically someone's greatest contribution to air pollution. So this is why we need to target personal vehicles for reevaluation. This is why people should opt for hybrid cars instead of conventional cars. And here is the evidence. We're drawing on these journals where we know that a majority of Americans' annual emissions come from driving. And so we make that link back to the subclaim really explicit, sort of uniting the argument. So reminding readers that the switch would decrease overall emissions. And so that's why we need this technology. This is why we should have or prioritize these cars over others. And then you continue on for as many subclaims as you have that are specific to your overarching argument. And you continue on. And then you consider how that paragraph might be structured. Typically, it looks sort of like an hourglass where you're making that sort of link to the context of the subclaim, and then you're really engaging with the evidence in the middle, and then you branch out a little bit in order to start moving into the next subclaim. So on a simplified level, it might look like something like this. With their unique engineering that reduces reliance on fossil fuels, hybrid cars can be understood as a viable strategy for reducing air pollution in Canada and the United States. Presently, an average American's car driving habit accounts for a clear majority of personal emissions. Recent studies have determined that 55% of Americans' annual emissions comes from driving. Given that cars are currently the largest source of privately produced air pollution in North America, switching to hybrid cars would significantly reduce overall emissions. Okay, so if we were to break this down, and this is, again, it's a slightly simplified reflection, but we have that topic sentence where we are identifying the main point that we are trying to support. And then we have our evidence. We're drawing on data and facts and logic. And then we are returning back to that main claim, reiterating why we need to embrace this, this vehicle over others because of this reason. Now, counterclaim and rebuttal. This is where an argument can really shine, because it's going to show your reader that you have really thought through the different scenarios. And you've thought about the fact that other people are going to have different perspectives on the topic, and you're anticipating them. You're not ignoring them, you're addressing them really explicitly, but you're providing an argument around whether or not we should give these other perspectives time or recognition. So the counterclaim that we might have here is that forget about cars, forget about personal vehicles, because that just continues this culture of driving. So yes, it might cut someone's emissions by half, but they're still producing a significant amount of air pollution. So why are we focusing on personal transport when we could focus instead on mass transit? Why is that not the priority? And this is a very logical stance that someone might take. And so you have to anticipate it and then engage with it. So sort of show that, again, you've thought through your argument and all of the elements that people might bring to the table as they engage with your text. So you rebut it, you acknowledge it as a concern, but explain why you have to think about other things. So you might say something like, although mass transit is an environmentally sound idea that should be encouraged, it's not feasible in many rural and suburban areas or for people who must commute to work. Thus, hybrid cars are a better solution for much of the nation's population. And so this, again, it's sort of showing that you're not afraid to engage with other people's opinions and perspectives. Now, one common issue is that of skipped bridges, but because of time, I think we're just going to jump ahead. Because I want to look again at this notion of rebuttal in a slightly more complex scenario. Because when we're talking about argument, again, it's really about trying to anticipate what your reader is going to bring to the reading experience. What kind of objections or questions are they going to have? Anticipate those and engage with them. So you can do this in several ways. Again, you have that rebuttal, that refutation, or you can concede that there's validity there, but that your claim is still ultimately the stronger of the two. And sometimes it can be a difficult decision to make, but if the counter argument is valid, if it has merit, you want to acknowledge that. But then again, you want to engage with some of the subtlety of why your claim is still the stronger one. And you can also qualify the counter argument by sort of not minimizing it, but putting it within its specific limitations, recognizing that, yes, this idea has merit in these conditions, but we need to extend this further. We need to go in a different direction. And that's what we're doing with our argument. So here we have an example of a more sustained refutation in context. And let's break it down as we have to unfortunately wrap up in about 2 minutes. So and this is in relation to video games. Although these studies have provided insights into the behaviors of children who play violent video games, they do not offer conclusive evidence of a link between video gaming and violent behaviors because researchers have not considered all contextual variables. These factors include the level of competitiveness, difficulty, and pace of action of the game and how these impact the player's response. Adachi and Willoughby suggest that aggression observed in gamers could be linked to the difficulty of the game used for the test. They point out that violent video games are more difficult and much more competitive than non-violent video games, which in itself could lead to frustration and possible violent behavior. Research that adequately considers all variables will need to be conducted before conclusions are drawn between violent video games and violent behavior. So here, what we see is that you're acknowledging other findings, but then sort of rejecting them. And identifying instead some alternate explanations. So you're making use of available evidence to offer this sort of counterpoint to what might be some broader claims that people are making about this kind of entertainment. So we are almost out of time. I want to share with you a resource that you can check out of the library if you're local. It's called They Say, I Say, and it's worth seeing if you can see a preview of this text to see if it would be of interest to you. It's a very short little book, but what's kind of neat is that they do identify how you can structure an academic argument complete with some sample sentence frames. Now, in terms of common challenges, it can be difficult to sustain an argument. It can either become repetitive, or you might start following tangents, or you might just have difficulty seeing the gaps. So if you're having these issues, I recommend creating a reverse outline so that you can see, oh, what did I actually end up writing? Because often the text that we produce can be quite different from our initial outline. And then if you have questions again, and you want to test the strength of your argument, you can ask, okay, why is this important? You can ask that of every single paragraph that you've written. Why is this important? What does my reader need to know about this? How does this advance my argument? And it can also be very useful to get perspectives from readers as well. So get someone to help you interrogate your text. So I have to rush out. I apologize for having to skim over a little bit. But if you have questions, do feel free to reach out. I'll just throw my email in the chat here. I have to rush out to another Zoom session. So again, if you have questions, do feel free, send me an email. I apologize for having to rush a little bit this afternoon.
No worries. Thank you, Jill.
Take care.
Thanks so much. Okay, I'm going to stop the recording now. Have a good afternoon.